Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Fire 2020's Entry-Level Testing Issues and Answers webinar. The webinar today is brought to you by Scott Safety and Lion, with support from PBI Performance Products, Cigna, Tincata, Citrix, and our media sponsor, Fire Chief Magazine.
Just some general guidelines before we get started. Please turn off all radios, TVs, and other electronic devices in case any feedback comes over the line. We have muted all of the attendees, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please bring it to the attention of the organizer through chat. Technical quality is directly related to the speed of your internet connection. Today your moderator is going to be Larry Sagan, and your facilitators and organizer is myself, Cami Higa, and also Odessa Kovai. I'm going to hand it over to Larry so he can go through our agenda and then introduce our panelists, and we can get started.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Fire 2020 webinar on testing, issues and answers. So here's our agenda for this morning. One of the things that I'd like to say before we get into the specific webinar around entry-level testing today is that a solid recruitment effort, not just marketing, but actually being out in the community and recruiting qualified, inclusive, diverse, and safety-conscious applicants combined with effective and validated testing is really the most successful way and the most effective way to move towards an inclusive and diverse workforce. Recently, Fire 2020 has launched consulting services, and we are now helping departments to map their communities, to review their recruitment processes, and we have found that that really can make an impact by bringing more qualified people into the testing process. This is not just about more people, it's about getting the right people to your testing process. So let's move forward. Love to introduce the panelists today. We'll give each of them an opportunity to give you just a little bit of background on who they are and some of the things that they've been doing. We've got a great cross-section. All of them are seasoned veterans in the field of testing. They have all been working and have dealt with the legal system, really understand the ins and the outs of challenges to testing, and so I feel very, very excited that we've got some of the best of the best. Just a quick note, Fire 2020 is not here to endorse any of these people other than to say that they are all qualified and they all have exceptional tests. First, Carl Swander is the owner of Ergometrics. Carl's been working in this field for a number of years. Chris Hornick is the president of CWH out of Colorado. And Jerry Greenwell is CEO of CPS HR Consulting out of Sacramento. Carl, let me turn it over to you first, and maybe you could do just a minute or so introduction on who you are and a little bit of background.
Great, thanks, Larry. And just start off by thanking you for having us on today. I think it's a valuable opportunity for us to get together and talk about the issues. So, again, my name is Carl Swander. I am an industrial organizational psychologist. I graduated from Virginia Tech a number of years ago, and with my dissertation and all my major work related to public safety testing, in particular simulation-based tests, and in public safety. So going in a little more in depth about our company, we are a dedicated public safety company that's been in the field for about developing a simulation-based test. We're well known for our video-based entry-level and promotional programs. Some of them you might have heard of through public safety testing, which is Fire Team and our Frontline National Testing programs. Over the last about 7 years, we've also further expanded our outreach to cover some of the testing process itself through test administration, recruitment, and again, more of the consolidation and outsourcing of the testing process to kind of link those two together, that we have maximally effective tests and process as well. So we've been all over the country. We have about 1,450 clients that use our programs. We've had a lot of success in validation and working with the Department of Justice and other entities in ensuring that our tests are defensible and valid. So again, thanks for having me on here today.
Great. Chris, you want to jump in here and give a little background on CWH and yourself?
Sure. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Hornick. I'm the president of CWH Research, and very similar to Carl, we do entry-level and promotional testing in all public safety, both law enforcement and firefighting. I began my career in this consulting practice in the very early 80s and have been doing this since that time. I think some of the things that are critical and important for me are that we measure what's most important in hiring people or in making decisions about promotions, that we measure what's critically important early in the process. A lot of times we talk about measuring skills that we've already administered a written test and other steps in the process, and we haven't actually measured some of the more critical skills until later in the process when the written test is used as an initial screening device. Obviously, you've not screened people on the basis of some of the critical skills. I think the other thing that identifies a lot of who we are is trying to understand what impacts diversity and what impacts discrimination or adverse impact in testing. And we have a commitment to continually developing our processes to address those issues to help departments diversify their membership. So I'm very pleased to be here, and Larry, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Chris. Glad you're here. Jerry?
I'm Jerry Greenwell, CEO at CPS HR Consulting. We've been in the public safety testing arena since probably 1985. We have clients throughout the U.S. I come at this from really an organizational development perspective as the leader of this organization. We have a strong and robust I.O. staff. We have off-the-shelf and custom exams like the other two indicated. For me, our approach really is looking at the organization from a systemic standpoint and looking at how do we get the kind of diversity that government needs to be successful. We think it's a good business practice, and I'm always marveled by how sometimes we still have to convince people that it's a good thing to do. And there are some areas of the country where it really is an issue. And so trying to come up with solutions, whether it be in terms of the instruments that we use or in the recruiting practices, the outreach, to really make sure that we're bringing a diverse group candidate pool to the table is really important, because I think ultimately as you look at how our society has changed demographically, it's important that our public sector organizations are representative of the citizens. And so for me, I'm not the doctor that the other two are, and I rely on them for their expertise as well as the I.O. folks that work for me. But as I said, my issue is usually around how do we bring the best and most diverse workforce to government so government can be at its best.
That's
great.
Thank
you for being here.
That's great. Thank you. One of the things that I like about this webinar technology is that we can throw up some questions to try to give the panel a little bit better idea of who's out there. So we have a quick question up, and if you could just respond about what area you come from, so that we know if you're from HR, are you working at this from a chief level? Are you specifically a recruitment officer or another area? So if you could just take a second on your screen if you are online and respond to that, and we'll be able to let the panel know exactly who's here. Thank you. So let's just kind of take a look at who's on the call. So we've got 31% from HR, about 40% are chiefs and chief officers, 13% from recruitment, and 16% other. So hopefully that'll give the panel a little bit of an understanding of who they're talking to today. Cami, can you, we'll launch a second question. One of the things that comes up is this question about validated testing. And I'd like to put it out to the three panelists. We talk about, is a test valid? What does that really mean? Carl, you want to take a stab at that first?
Sure, absolutely. So in terms of our validation and thinking about what if a test is valid or not is first and foremost, is it measuring the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are necessary to perform the job? And that's one that's established through a content validation process of job analysis and looking at what are the critical elements to success and failure within those jobs, and not only does it represent the entire matrix of what the job entails, but diving in for us in depth of does the test get at the important predictors of somebody's ability to do those things, which is kind of getting into the second type of validation, which would be looking at does the test actually statistically correlate with performance on the job, or criterion validation. So where we actually take incumbents and give them the test and look at their supervisors' ratings of performance. So those are two broad types of validation strategies that we use in validating our exams.
Chris, do you have anything to add to that about issues that people on this webinar should know about validation?
I think Carl covered the basics of the technical aspect of it. Yes, you should be using a valid test. Validity, however, is tied to the purpose that you use the test for. In Carl's discussion, he was talking about correlation with job performance. If you can demonstrate that people who score well or highly on the test that you're using also tend to be people who are the better, higher job performers, then that creates a validity that allows you to use that test for a hiring purpose. Using the test for other purposes requires that you validate it for another purpose as opposed to hiring. Most tests that exist today, provided by consultants or otherwise, have demonstrated validity in various contexts. And so what you look for in a test that you're using for your institution is a test that has demonstrated validity in the type of department that you are. So if you're a very large department or a very small department or someplace in between, you just want reassurances that the test works within the environment and within your organization.
That's great. Jerry, anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when Carl talks about predictors, so when we talk about entry level, the big issue is predictability. How is this person going to perform on this job? And that's always a challenge, because if we're not following them through and seeing whether they're successful down the line, then it's really hard to make those accurate predictions. So it's at some level, it is, how they perform on the test is just an indication of where they are at that given time. So a lot of times what we look at when we're dealing with organizations is, what does your performance management process look like? Because that piece of measurement tied to how they perform on the test is really going to tell you whether they are actually successful going through your organization and evolving as an employee. So like with most things, just one measure doesn't really give you what you need in terms of, is this the best employee, or are they going to be successful on the job?
That's great. And just kind of as an overview, when we're talking about entry-level testing, and panel members, please chime in if I miss something here, but usually we're talking about some kind of a cognitive test that's usually done as a written test. In the case of Carl and Ergometrics, they offer a situational judgment video test. There's a mechanical aptitude test that's oftentimes used by departments to determine not if somebody has the mechanical skills, but do they have the aptitude to learn mechanical skills? Some departments have a math test. Some have a reading test. One of the topics we'll be covering today is physical agility test. Some departments, and I think a growing number of departments, are using psychological tests. There's an oral interview that is oftentimes integrated into the testing process. Lie detector tests are used by some departments. Most departments today are now doing some level of background check, and most departments do a physical examination once somebody has gone through the whole process to determine that they're still in good physical condition, or that they are in good physical condition perhaps after a job has been offered. Am I missing anything to the panel? Jerry, is there anything here that I'm missing that should be indicated?
No, I think you covered it. It's really, when you look at the written test, the oral, the MQs, all of that is used to determine how to get somebody on the eligible list. And typically it's been a cognitive exam because that's usually the easiest to administer and the most cost-effective. But as I said before, that's just the beginning of the process, and it should not be the end of the process. But I think what you covered is pretty accurate.
Okay. So, Chris, what kinds of things should departments be considering besides just the written test to ensure that they're both identifying the qualities and skills and also trying to make sure that we're not cutting people out of the process in some kind of adverse impact?
I'm going to take this a slightly different direction and then come back to that if I can. One of the things that I think is absolutely critical, and the research we've done over the last 30 years has very clearly confirmed this, cognitive skills are the easiest to measure. They are the best research skills in our profession, and there is a tremendous amount of data and research that supports that cognitive skills predict success in most jobs. However, just because it's the easiest to measure doesn't mean it's what you should be measuring or emphasizing, and our research has clearly shown that interpersonal skills, which can be measured in a written test and in other formats, emotional skills, emotional intelligence, common sense, practical intelligence. There are many different kinds of intelligence that are much more important in predicting success in the jobs. Those of you who are in the fire profession or in HR can clearly relate to scenarios and situations where the people that become problem children in our businesses and in our work are not people who lack cognitive ability. It's generally people who don't know how to treat others, who don't know how to manage their own emotional reactions to others. And it's critically important that you measure those other qualities and skills as early as possible in the selection process. With regard to other steps, you can certainly measure those qualities at the earliest level. Some skills, however, need to be bolstered and evaluated in different contexts. In particular, interpersonal skills, you can certainly ask people, here's a situation where interpersonal skills are needed. How would you handle this situation? And if you can recognize the correct behaviors, you can do well on that test. It's another thing when you meet the person and do an interview with them, and now you learn a lot more about their interpersonal skills. So I think the other steps that ought to be involved are an oral exam is, I think, a critical piece to being able to evaluate some of those other qualities and skills and do it in more depth and a more valid way.
Great. Carl, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit, because I think Chris and Jerry hit a lot of it there, and just an overall framework of how you look at what might be necessary in your testing process, what components. I always like to think of it as a blueprint. So you've got to look at the blueprint of the skills and knowledge, skills and abilities that are important, and start mapping in the instruments that you're using into that blueprint. And so again, if you're hitting various skills through the written test, if you want to add in other components, which is great, interviews and all of those have definitely shown that they have incremental validity, can impact diversity, then you should be looking at where in that blueprint do we have gaps in our assessment, because that's where you'll get the most effectiveness by adding more assessment. That probably as we're all measurement people, we'd all agree that more assessment is better. I mean, the more measurement you have, the more you're going to be able to predict somebody's potential success. But if we're filling in those gaps and making sure that we're comprehensively measuring somebody's ability to do the job, we're going to be more effective at it. And from our research, again, the same with what Chris is saying is that you find that impacts diversity and other things in a positive way, because we're not limited to one narrowly focused construct. So we're opening it up to saying there's a lot of different skills that are needed to be successful on the job, and some of them, such as human interaction, teamwork, those kind of things are just as critical, if not more critical, in these occupations.
We got a couple of questions coming in from the participants. One question from Liz talks about the fact that most of the tests, and Liz, I'm assuming that you're referring to the written tests, tend to still have some unintended consequences around adverse impact. What kinds of things can we do with the written tests that are going to minimize that adverse impact, in your opinion? Jerry?
Well, I don't think you'll ever get rid of it. But I think, as Carl and Chris have indicated, the question is how relative is it to success on the job? And really trying to hone in on, in fact, I liked his description of the blueprint, because I think we've tried a lot of different things, but you can't control who shows up. And that's always the variable in this process that you just have to deal with it, because you don't know who's going to show up at your door to take the test. And so you can do a lot of work with the items, making sure you have a content valid test, making sure you have, even if you go into the level of criterion validation on the test, but ultimately the candidate pool is the candidate pool, or the applicant pool is the applicant pool, and they're going to perform based on whatever they bring in. And so I think sometimes there is a misnomer that you can continue to massage the test so you're going to get it so that you don't have adverse impact. I don't think you can actually eliminate it, because I think you can't predict who's going to show up. And as a matter of fact, when we just did an exam with Anaheim, and we decided instead of doing the written first, we would apply some of the Hogan assessments. So it's another way to slice at the pool earlier. And it's interesting because candidates who would probably have been selected out during the interview process actually then got selected out, I think, up front before the written. But even in that case, we would not consider that to be the only measure to use. So I think you can move the process around and you can manipulate the tools, but ultimately it's about how diverse and how broad of a net can I cast to bring the candidate pool in, because that's really where I wouldn't say the rubber meets the road, but that's really ultimately that's going to determine how successful you are.
Chris, have you found anything in your process to be able to reduce some of that adverse impact?
Yes, we have, and I guess I'd take a slightly different tack. I think you can impact the people who apply by using a very focused and targeted recruitment process. Secondly, I would say that you can dramatically impact adverse impact. It requires years of research and understanding of those things which contribute to adverse impact. Also, the measurement of other skills and abilities that are not traditionally included. For example, I mentioned other things other than non-cognitive skills like interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, practical intelligence. What we found is that the measurement of those other dimensions, if included in a valid statistical model, allows you to minimize differences in scores, group differences, typically by ethnicity, allows you to minimize those score differences by including the measurement of some of these other qualities and skills that the research clearly has shown in my 30 years to be more predictive and more important of job performance. So it's not just broadening the dimensions that you measure at the earliest stages in the testing process, but it's having research data where you can evaluate. I mean, if you notice that certain types of test items and certain types of styles and language and approaches impact adverse impact by looking at that research with collecting data from test takers over time, it allows you then to modify and change the methodology and approach and the style of how you do your questions. And that's how we've managed to dramatically reduce the adverse impact in the written tests that we have. I would agree with what Jerry said, though. There probably will, for some significant period of time, continue to be some adverse impact in testing. I just think we as industrial psychologists need to be focusing our energies and our time on that issue and that variable. And it takes a lot of work and time to do it, but I think it's well worth it.
Carl, anything from your perspective? You've taken a little bit of a different twist on this with your video test. How is that doing in terms of impacting adverse impact?
You know, we find really good results in terms of developing simulations. It's one of the powerful elements of a simulation is that you're actually merging a lot of different knowledge, skills, and abilities into a behavior. So, you know, Chris talked about situational judgment tests. These are similar to situational judgment tests, except they're video simulations. So you're actually putting people in the job and actually seeing how they're behaving. So in terms of adverse impact within a video-based simulation, we see very good results. The return on those in terms of the validity is up there, comparable to cognitive ability, with significantly less adverse impact. And I think in agreement with the panel is that's our approach as well. Is that we as scientists need to continue to look at how we can develop these tests to be highly valid, find the right person that has a high probability of being successful in a job, and minimizes impact to diverse groups. And so I think we're always reaching to try and find new ways of assessment, new measurement. We're continually adding elements to our simulations. We're continually building on those to make them better and to improve the science. But then again, going back to what Jerry said, is that you can't always look at just the test in isolation. You can have sound methodology. You can have hundreds of thousands of cases that you're looking at for statistics, and you can have samples that fall on the outer realm of the distribution of adverse impact or other things. And so it's always important to understand that both of those are critical to look at, that what you feed into the process ultimately impacts the process itself. So as long as you know that you are putting your time and effort and science into putting that process together, then you still need to also look at how you're getting those candidates, what's the messaging that you're doing out there, what's the long-term outreach, because ultimately they're not something you can separate, really. They both go hand in hand.
So I have noticed in our work with departments all across the U.S. and Canada that a lot of times the test ends up, and this is just kind of following up with what the three of our panel members said, that the test ends up as the stop place, and everybody blames the test, or everybody's asking about, well, why has this test got adverse impact, and we're not hiring any more people, and we've tried 4 different companies' tests, and we're still running into the same problem. And in support of what the three of you said, if you don't get the right people to the test, and you're just based on marketing this like any other job, chances are you're always going to end up with what looks like some level of adverse impact, and that's really why we need to be doing a better job of recruiting. Now that's a FIRE 2020 perspective. I don't know. Let me throw that out real quickly. Have you seen that with all the different departments that you've been working in?
Who do you want to go first?
Go for it, Chris.
Well, one of the things that none of the three of us spoke about is that there are system issues that most of the agencies we work with operate under. For example, there are civil service rules and other rules that dictate how agencies use their testing scores. For example, if you arbitrarily set a cutoff score, many civil service rules, for example, say, well, you have to use 70%. Well, that's a completely arbitrary cut point. It relates, obviously, to our understanding of the educational system, and a 70 is considered a C, and anything below that is a fail or a D or an F, and likewise higher scores relate to the educational system. But in reality, that's a completely arbitrary cut point, and what I would encourage agencies to do is to look at other alternatives within their systems for how they utilize the test. Also, I think evaluating the adverse impact of the test and helping to consider where you're going to be setting your cut point is a critical, responsible approach to looking at your applicant pools. You want to be able to diversify, and sometimes an arbitrary cut point or using the test in a top-down rank order process ends up tremendously adding to your adverse impact when it's really unnecessary. The test will measure the qualities and skills, and many of that can be reduced. Finally, to the point that Larry brought up, your targeted recruitment is going to be a huge part of the success that you're going to have. With one of the clients that we're working with right now, we have been working with them. They have created their own mentoring program and have used an outreach system to reach minorities and women to encourage their interest in the fire department. And what they've done is they've actually gone back to previous testing procedures, have been evaluating through a recruitment survey what aspects of recruitment have been successful, and then using the information about those people who didn't show up to the written test, for example, in a previous year, to create a mentoring program where they get some tutoring and some training. And it's obviously open to everyone, including whites, and whites do attend the classes. But they're targeting the outreach to people on the basis of increasing and encouraging people that match the profiles of what they're looking for to increase the diversity in their departments.
Jerry, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my only comment would be on agreeing with Chris in terms of the pass point setting. We've seen where they've done an effective job of outreach and recruitment, and then when it comes to a few delta points on the scale in terms of a 70 versus, let's say, a 68 or 67, where they could actually increase the diversity in their pool, they lock in on that 70, and now all of a sudden you have appeals and you end up in court because the judge, in fact, we've had one client where the judge said you couldn't move it 2 points because the question is what are you trying to accomplish? And when you have that set pass point, a lot of times it just doesn't help in terms of creating the diversity, the diverse pool that we need for the appropriate level of competition on the job. So to me, that would be the big issue that we see all the time, is trying to get the client not to preset it and really to look at their rules, because as we look at organizations, there are a lot of systemic issues that get in the way of our ability to fill the jobs in organizations. And so part of it is how do the civil service rules either support or inhibit the agency's ability to attract and recruit the right kind of applicants? But I would say anytime you have a standard like a set pass point, it really inhibits your ability to get at diversity. It really does.
So one of the questions that came in, and we hear this all the time, is about concerns of lowering standards, that if we make a test, if we create tests that have little adverse impact, that we're not really using the test to identify the best applicants. Carl, do you have any thoughts at all about this idea of lowering standards? It comes up all the time.
Yeah, I hear that as well, and I hear it in some ways. There are kind of two issues related to it, because I've seen both play out, and that sometimes, depending on again what the test is that's being used and the testing process itself, is that standards are lowered. I mean that basically, there's no understanding of why that pass point is set in a certain way, or what tests are being used, and so just in general, standards are being lowered because that would, based on that applicant pool that they might have, that they're going to include more diverse candidates. However, what I typically more run into is that organizations, they like to throw out, because somebody has recommended a passing point of 70 or 75 or 65, or again, the number is actually arbitrary, that's the ultimate point in the scale that defines somebody who will be successful versus somebody who will not be successful. And I think there's a big misunderstanding there, and that truly, if you have criterion validation, which we do a lot of, so I always kind of talk in terms of criterion validation, is that we're making an assessment of potential or risk that we're taking with a candidate. So as we lower the score or the passing point on an exam, we're taking on more risk that person might not be suitable to do the job. But we're not ultimately saying that person won't do the job, they can't do the job. We're saying that it's, again, the probability of them being successful is getting lower as we go down. And if we set some kind of minimum score, then based on what we see in the job, that those persons have a higher likelihood of not being successful than being successful. So, but when you start thinking about it in terms of that, 1 point, 2 points, if you see significant differences in your candidate pool, based on like Jerry's example there, then it's justifiable to look at those differences, because ultimately you're probably not taking that much of a probability risk in moving down if you could capture some of that diversity. And the second part is that if you know that you are going just a little bit lower than those standards, then there are things that departments do all over the country. I mean, they understand this, and they implement a little more in-depth training or again, awareness within their academies that they need to make sure that people coming on are not struggling with the textbooks that they need to be reading in order to be successful. So, more of that on-the-job mentoring and getting people ready for the actual job, which can significantly help somebody's chances and minimize some of the impact of making those decisions.
I mean, just
Chris,
a comment.
Jerry, go ahead.
Just, and I think it was a few years ago when the courts threw out the New York test 3 times. And at some point, you have to look at it, as Chris said, from a systemic standpoint. You can only do so much with the test. And so, the judge kept saying, I want a test that doesn't have adverse impact. And it's almost like, well, let's look at where we're recruiting. Let's look at the type of candidates we're bringing to and let's look at what other measures we can use to ensure that we can get a representative pool. So I agree, at some point it does the pass point correlate with success on the job? That's really what it comes down to. So when you're looking at setting it, those are the things that you have to look at.
So Paul submitted a question about targeted recruitment, and we had talked about this in a couple of previous webinar sessions that we did. I've had numerous conversations with people from the Department of Justice, and if you have underrepresented populations in your department, meaning women, people of color, that it is totally legal for a department to put taxpayer dollars towards targeted recruitment of trying to increase the number of qualified applicants from those categories. It is not legal to do targeted hiring unless, of course, DOJ or a court comes in and says this is what you're going to do because you're not doing a good job. But for all of the people on the webinar this morning, you certainly, if you have underrepresented groups in your department and you want to increase that, you certainly can do targeted recruitment. The second thing that I'd like to say, just as an editorial comment based on some of the questions coming in, is that this term qualified really ranges across a continuum. And the fact that somebody scores significantly high, let's say on the physical agility test, is not a guarantee that they're necessarily the most qualified applicant. It simply means that they scored very high on a physical agility test. So the question I put out to the panel is, what's your thoughts about rank order, or about specific numerical scoring versus some pass-fail components? Chris?
I'm going to speak heresy here for a second, but I think we as psychologists, we as researchers, and most people in the world of work have placed way too much value in test scores. By way of example, and I'll get to the targeted recruitment in just a second, somebody who, the best tests in the world in predicting success in various jobs account for a maximum of about 25% of the differences that we see in job performance. So in other words, 25% of the time, 75% of the time there are other issues and variables which determine a person's success. For example, do they show up to work on time? Do they have a good positive attitude in the job? You may measure certain pieces of that, but statistically we can't hit more than about 25%. What we've done, though, as a society, as we have raised the value of test scores to such a point that we all talk about differences in 1 or 2 points as somehow determining whether a person is the best for the job or not. Let me just say this. There's a lot of error in our measurement. Carl's test isn't perfect. CWH's test isn't perfect. CPS's test isn't perfect. We all know that. You should all recognize that too. And you should look at the value of the ranges of scores and the fact that people are homogeneous and similar in score ranges to each other. So sometimes we put way too much stock into lowering standards. We think somehow that a few points in a test distribution is getting us less qualified people. And the way I would ask everybody to look at that is think about all the promotional tests that you've seen and the candidates who sometimes don't have the highest test scores also tend to be some of the ones that are excellent performers. Again, it's because we have an imperfect measurement system. Enough said about that. With regard to targeted recruitment, I could not concur more with what Larry said. Targeted recruitment is absolutely legal. It is completely and totally appropriate. Think of it in a real simple lay terms. What do you do when you have a product and you want to penetrate a different market? You target that market to sell your product. We're doing exactly the same thing. You're selling your department and your profession to encourage people who are different than the traditional norm that you see applying and being successful in the process. That is absolutely legal. It is also prudent to do that because you're trying to make a change in the representation of your department to better reflect the community. So, yes, it's absolutely right. Larry is also correct that if you are to make a race-based decision in terms of hiring someone, now you're violating the Civil Rights Act and Title VII, et cetera. So there is a distinction there, but target the people that you want and put your time, money, and energy into the recruitment of ethnic minorities and women and other underrepresented groups in your departments. As long as you do not, and the word here is exclusion, if you exclude white males from participating in anything you do, you now have a legal liability.
So one of the things that we've discovered is that the focus has really been on numbers, and when things end up going to the courts go back to this whole numbers question. And I think one of the things that we've really been learning is that diversity, that is to say numbers that reflect a community, never drive inclusion. That is not a predictable result. However, if you work on creating an inclusive environment, that will drive diversity because the department will be demonstrating that they are inclusive and welcoming to people who of all races, genders, sexual orientations, backgrounds, learning styles, etc. Are there any ways to be able to get, and one of the things that Chief Deborah Meska from Madison taught me is it is every bit as important to get the right white male in creating that inclusive environment as people of color or male and females, etc. Is there any way to test to see if somebody is going to be coming in with more inclusive values and attitudes? Carl?
Yes, I mean, I think we've been touching on that a little bit in that we're. I mean, I agree first that quality is the #1 focus when you're developing the test, when you're putting your process together. Is you know, if you bear down and you're always looking at what's going to get us the people and all, you know, the full range of skills and abilities that are required, then you're ultimately going to have a good testing process coming out of it. And one of those things that we see consistently in the research is that teamwork, interpersonal skills, and, you know, the emotional ability, and all those various factors that are related to working with people are really critical in public safety jobs, not only because they work in highly cohesive team environments, but they also work with the public, and the public is diverse, and they have to provide services in a wider range of situations. You know, in terms of some of the elements that we specifically include in developing the test is through our use of video. We get the benefit of being able to actually show diverse situations and measure people's responses to interacting with the full spectrum of people, whether it's internal people or external people. So in that sense, you know, the more that you can simulate those critical elements of the job and focusing on who's going to do a better job, the better off you're going to be in all capacities, including inclusion and working with a diverse group of people, because ultimately it will be a diverse group of people these days if we're being somewhat successful even of getting the right people to come in and test and putting quality tests and process in place.
Jerry, you're an organizational development person and come from that background. Do you have a comment at all about you know, using the selection process to try to create a more inclusive department, not just more racially and gender diverse?
Sure, and I go back to what Chris said at the, toward the beginning, when you look at interpersonal skills, emotional skills, and as he said, common sense, and you smack that up against the situational judgment type items that you would look at, that's going to help you determine how is a person going to react in a culturally diverse environment. I mean, it's not going to tell you everything, but it's going to give you at least some sense of how the person's going to react. Then on the other side, when I look at a lot of the communities and why we can't attract those women and minority candidates, it's because, one, is it an inviting environment? Is it accepting and tolerant culturally? And a lot of times the agencies aren't viewed that way. And so it's really hard to get folks to apply into those organizations because they're not viewed as being accepting and tolerant and willing to deal with the cultural diversity that comes with being reflective of the community. And so I think when you look at those two aspects, one would be looking at other factors other than just the cognitive exam in terms of how we recruit people into the organization, and then looking at how do we create a culture that is accepting and inviting, that works with the community. Then I think we'll have a better chance of attracting the type of diverse workforce that we need.
So one of the things that we found in support of that, Jerry, is that you really have to be working two sides against the middle. And I think that to reinforce what you just said is you've got to be working on your inside audience to make sure that if people come in and come on board who might think differently, look differently, etc., it makes it really difficult to go out and approach the community. So we really do have to be working on both sides, the inside and going out to the community.
Well, and for us, I think, I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, Carl.
Go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, to me, that's a leadership issue. And so, when we look at what does our department look like, what does our department behave like, how does our department interact with the community, how does the community view us in terms of their perception of us as an agency, it comes back to a leadership style and a leadership way of operating. So to me, that's where, so when I talked about at the beginning, we look at this from an organizational development and a systemic standpoint. We always start at the leadership side and say, what kind of agency are you trying to create here? Because once you can determine that, then you can say, okay, these are the steps and measures I need to take to create that kind of organization. If you're not looking to create that organization, then you're not just fighting against the middle, you're fighting to not move forward. So,
Chris, did you want to weigh in on this? We'll bring up your slide.
Yeah, the purpose of the slide is really to just help people think about this in a broader perspective. We're talking about targeted recruitment. You need to think about some of the other things that are listed on this slide, and we've already talked about most of these. For me, Jerry hit it really well. He said that you need to think about, essentially what he was saying was you need to think about the values of your organization. I work with one fire chief who has created the concept of courageous conversations. What he's done is he has essentially created the culture within the organization that it's appropriate and it's okay, and you need to learn to have the skills to be able to carry on a conversation about difficult topics. The same thing's true if you're talking about the value of diversity in the department. You want to create the environment and you want to make people feel welcome who traditionally might not understand or see themselves as being welcomed in a certain environment. So in the scenario and situation that we're talking about here, you need to be able to assess those skills as early as possible in the process. In an oral exam, well, let's take it back. In a written exam, I can write a situational judgment question where I create a scenario the person may or may not have familiarity with, and then I ask them what they would do in that situation. Again, recognition, if you know the appropriate behaviors, if you've had familiarity with something similar to it, you draw upon that to be able to give your answer. And you can write the options on the test item to reflect somebody who values an inclusive work environment. You can also, in a structured oral interview, go into much greater depth and write a much more complex question, which now it's no longer asking the person, do they recognize the correct or appropriate thing to do? They have to talk about what their own values are in responding to it. And then you build into the scoring on that structured interview item, giving people greater scores who reflect value systems that support an inclusive environment. And a lot of times what happens in research is people look at a situational judgment item and they think you're asking them about their judgment, when really what you've done in crafting the scoring key for the oral interview question or for the written test item to reward people for demonstrating the qualities and skills that you most want. It's an art, but it's the best way in my research and experience to be able to assess people on those qualities and skills that we're talking about here.
One of the concerns, and this is great, and really I think really opens up to some of the questions that came in, and we'll cut this off at about in about 10 minutes and go to direct questions that people have been submitting to make sure we cover as much as possible. But this whole issue, people are scared about oral interviews because historically, in a closed culture in the fire service, that's really where a lot of nepotism ended up coming out. Yet, Chris, you're talking about really structuring an oral interview or an oral board in a way that is going to be fair to everybody. I put it out to the panel. Do you have any suggestions at all about who should be on an oral board if you're doing interviews as part of your entry-level testing process? Carl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a wide range of perspectives is usually the most beneficial for the organization. So, you know, a lot of times, again, it depends on what skills and abilities you're looking at with that interview. But you're not talking about fire-specific knowledge, and so it doesn't benefit you necessarily just to have a firefighter's perspective. So, you know, oftentimes using somebody somebody else within a firefighter, somebody else within the city, and even maybe a community member can make a very effective panel if you do the right things around that panel. If the right training is taking place with the panel members, if they're using some kind of consensus process, and again, if the interview is developed in a structured way with structured criteria and all the things that we know will make an effective interview, then that diverse look at that panel can definitely have an impact and gives people more input into making that ultimate rating of how that person is performing. So,
Jerry, have you worked to help departments with their oral interviews, both in terms of questions and in terms of helping to identify the best kind of panel members?
Yeah, I think so. At the and it depends on the level in the organization. It will depend on whether you bring in what level of outsiders. So if you're talking promotional levels, a lot of times you'll bring in folks from other agencies, other departments. At the entry level, what you're really looking at is within your organization a diverse pool of panel members that have the best ability to judge whether someone's going to be successful in the organization, and a lot of times, or what the organization is about culturally. So we've seen it where it'll be either 2 members of the fire service and 1 member of the HR organization, or conversely, 2 members of the HR organization and 1 member of the fire service. So you really want to make sure that it's not just all fire people or all HR people, because ultimately the combination of the thinking by both sides of those folks within HR and the fire service is really what defines what the organization is going to look like. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to structure a panel. I would go back to what Carl said. A lot of the issue is really around your inter-rater reliability with around the structured questions, and how are they viewing and observing the same things? Are they measuring it the same way? And how reliable are their scores when you come down to either a consensus rating or however you're scoring them? Really, how reliable are we in terms of what we're observing and hearing in the interview process? That's really gets at the crux of it, more so than the types of people you have on the panel. Because you can train a panel to do a really good job in terms of what they observe and what they hear. It helps to have diversity in the panel, because obviously that provides some face validity for the candidates. But you can deal with a lot of the misperceptions that come out by really spending a lot of times on the structured interview questions, the rating criteria, and how you debrief with the panel so that they're comfortable in terms of the scores that they're giving.
Great. We got a number of questions about physical agility tests, and let's just take a couple of minutes to address that before we get into some of the questions that are coming in from participants. You've all had experience working with the physical agility tests. We got questions from people who came on asking, do you recommend CPAT, or do you recommend the firefighter challenge test, or I don't really want to get into recommending one test over another, but can you speak to the physical agility test? Should it be rank ordered? Should it be pass-fail? Do you have any thoughts at all about how to improve? I know that typically it is seen as having adverse impact for women, smaller people, because of the upper body strength that's often required. Chris, you've done a lot of work with CPAT.
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on some of the oral stuff, but I'll switch to PAT and we can come back to that if there's time. I would strongly recommend that you use a physical ability test as a pass-fail. The CPAT is an excellent test, and some improvements and changes I think are necessary and have been done. I think the reason that you want pass-fail is because although there are advantages to people who are stronger, faster, bigger in performing some of the physical requirements of the job, anyone who's worked within the fire service knows that there are many different body sizes and statures and skills that are needed to be successful, and not everybody has them equally. There are times when strong physical brute strength is critical to achieving the mission. There are just as many opportunities where being able to fit into a tight, confined space, being able to deal with distraught victims or people who have been impacted by an emergency situation, those other qualities and skills are critical too. There is a minimum level that's required. There will be adverse impact. Women and people of smaller body stature do not have the physical skills to the same level that men do. And the Olympics have divisions based upon gender for an obvious reason, and I think we all just need to own that. But I think there's lots of things that you can do in designing your physical ability test and in encouraging people who may not have the same advantages to practice and develop through a mentoring program, their skills to understand what the test measures and where their weaknesses are, and then they can work to mentor and train and develop those skills. And that's, to me, the critical piece, is adding the mentoring to it.
And has the mentoring really shown to help, Chris?
Absolutely. Every department that we have worked with that has done that has had dramatic success in getting higher passing rates for women. Again, there's still adverse impact, significant adverse impact. There always will be. Also, you can include in the design of the physical ability test things that have less adverse impact. A quick example, you can have a dummy drag, have a 165-pound dummy. People who have brute strength, good lower body and upper body strength are going to be able to do that event faster. However, if you include in your physical ability test a critical quality that you need physically, that is dexterity, you can see essentially no differences by gender on the basis of including other elements in that physical ability test. It isn't always just brute strength that you should be measuring.
Carl, you're involved in doing some CPAT work. What is the mentoring program that you would recommend?
I think the mentoring program the CPAT has set up is, again, as Chris said, has been extremely effective. We've seen it time and again through our testing centers that people that have opportunity to participate in those mentoring sessions, and truly it's about availability and opportunity to be in those mentoring sessions is the critical aspect of it, so that it's not just we on the surface offer mentoring, one time every 3 months we'll let somebody come out and try it. It is that we're continually working with somebody. As we know, physical abilities is one of those things that you can improve somebody's physical fitness, 10 to 20%, given the appropriate exercise and the commitment to improving your strength. And in terms of the CPAT, there's a lot of elements of technique involved. So we've got to make sure the trend in the industry is going to CPATs, is going to simulation-based physical abilities tests, and which is great. They have high job relatedness. They are simulations, so in essence they are job related. But we got to make sure that we're not eliminating people based on technique factors. So again, as the brute strength of carrying a dummy, I've seen people go through that. They actually lift the dummy off the ground and they can walk it right around. It's very simple for them, whereas somebody of smaller stature has a lot of drag coefficient, that they're dragging that dummy. However, if they get training, mentoring on that, they understand the right techniques, they can do a lot better job, and it's actually easier than if you're just trying to keep up with somebody who's very large and muscular. So again, the mentoring we see, the most effective part of it is consistent mentoring that's available for people to actually do and continue to measure their performance on it, to keep going with that goal. Because as we disconnect our testing process from even recruitment and mentoring things that are going on, the less likely they are to be successful. So as we have them more frequently, more available, they can have a dramatic impact.
Great. So let's take some of the questions that we got coming in through the chat session. One of the questions has to do with psychological testing. It's probably I mean, my experience is that it's one of the more expensive elements of the testing process for entry level. Jerry, do you suggest psychological testing? Any kind of advice for people on the call that are looking at psychological testing?
Well, I think we'll go back to the, what is it you're trying to measure? What are you trying to determine in your organization? If you want to get at the interpersonal skills and the emotional skills that are going to be necessary for somebody to be successful within the organization, then I would recommend including that as a point of measurement in your process. You're right. It does add cost to your exam process. So a lot of times it depends on where you put it. Do you put it before the written or you put it after? As I mentioned earlier, we use some of the Hogan assessments in Anaheim before the written, and it was interesting getting the feedback from those that did not pass, just in terms of it actually worked. Now we'll see whether long term, whether the organization gets the results that they want. But I would say anytime you can hone in on whether or not you have best fit in your organization in terms of how an individual is going to react to the environment, then I would say, yeah, you should consider using those types of instruments.
Okay. Another question that came in, how do you address applicants that have either a learning disability or ADD in this testing process? Chris, you've dealt with that, right?
No, my clients have. Easy to pass that buck. No, just a couple of words of caution. One is, yes, you do want to accommodate. Two, there are impacts on the agency. One of the things that I recommend my clients do is obtain medical opinions that are on the applicant to provide. For example, if you say that your client has, or this person says that they have a learning disability, get a medical opinion as to the percentage of that disability. So for example, if it's a 20% disability, then what you might do is add 20% to the time limits for the test. Now, if it's somebody that requires that the test be administered in a different medium, now we're talking about a whole new scenario or situation.
Great. Again, we keep getting more questions about rank order, numerical scores. What happens if a department is just not willing to look at, for example, on the physical agility test, a pass-fail kind of scoring process? How does somebody who's inside the department address leadership about this? Are there legal issues, or where does that come from? Carl?
Good question. And we get this, I'm sure the others get this in terms of all the tests that are used. The physical abilities test in particular has this challenge in that especially if departments are seeing scores, they see people all the way up at the 5-minute range completing the CPAT all the way down to the 10 minutes and 20 seconds that is the threshold cut point. And they wonder why they can't take the people that are up top, or they want to use it in a rank order capacity. And there are definite implications of using it in a way that's not intended. And the basic rationale in terms of setting a pass point on a physical abilities test is that we basically can demonstrate that somebody needs to be able to perform at a certain level to do the job. We don't have a lot of evidence that would outweigh, obviously, the adverse impact that's going to happen if you start using this in a rank order capacity, that would say that those people that are bigger, stronger, faster than the minimum cut points are going to do better on the job. And that's the key piece of information that you need to know with all of your tests if you're going to look at using a rank order process, especially if it has any impact on diversity, is that if you can't say that we think that somebody with a higher score, or we have evidence to show that somebody with a higher score on this test is going to do better on the job, then you're going to have a tough time defending the use of your exam if there's adverse impact, and you have various challenges to that. So again, physical abilities is one of those processes that you would always recommend a pass-fail, minimum qualifications type of an exam, because there is not a lot of evidence out there to show that these tests, you need to be bigger, faster, stronger above these certain points to do the job. And in fact, as Chris and Jerry both said, is that there's a lot of different things that are important about the job. So if we're solely focused in on strength and stamina and the different physical requirements, then we're probably going to miss out on those other variables as well that are just as important to.
We've got a number of questions that we haven't gotten to, and what I'm going to ask of our panel is if we could just email them to you, and if you've got some thoughts on them, get them back to us ASAP, and then we'll get everything posted. We're getting to the end of our webinar time. The 75 minutes goes so quickly. I'd like to put it out to each of the panel members if you've got any kind of closing comments, and maybe one or two things that you would advise people to think about that they can take away from this webinar about the entry-level testing process that will help them to move forward in their own departments. Jerry, you want to take the first stab at this?
Yeah, I would just say that I think if you boil down to what we've talked about is that there are a lot of other factors that will determine whether someone will be successful in your organization, and you need to make sure that you consider that as you design your testing process. You need to really understand what success looks like in the organization and look at it from the standpoint of the incumbents and their experience and how they've moved through the organization. What were the hurdles? What were the things that help them be successful? So as you design your process, it's important to know that it'll never be perfect, but the idea is I'm trying to get applicants, candidates that will have the best chance of being successful in our organization, because ultimately folks come in at the entry level and they end up in leadership positions in your organization. So you have to keep that in mind, that they're not going to always be this entry-level firefighter. At some point, they're going to be in a command position and they're going to be in a leadership position. And so those are the things you need to consider when you look at those non-cognitive skills and those let's say, physical attributes about them, is whether or not this is a person that once they get into your organization is going to make you better than you are today.
Chris, you got some closing thoughts?
Actually, I wanted to talk about oral boards, so there. The closing comment I would make is that you have professionals in our field, industrial organizational psychology. 3 of them are on this phone call. Rely on them. Use their knowledge and abilities. We're consultants, and let us help you with the questions and the issues that you have. There's no possible way for us to be able to answer all of these questions in this one call. And yes, I'm frustrated. I wanted to talk more about oral boards. But the bottom line is, when we need somebody to deal with an emergency situation in the medical field, we contact and use the emergency system to respond to that. If you want somebody to build kitchen cabinets in your house, you get somebody who has that expertise and those skills. I think a lot of times what happens is we think we know a lot more about what we're doing than we do, and I would recommend that you utilize the qualities and skills that some other people have to help you do this. Designing a test, designing a structured oral interview, evaluating the validity of any of those components, a physical ability test, a mentoring program. Look for some people who have that expertise to help you, and then use your own judgment in making the decision that you have to do. Obviously, I think the 3 of us all have some of those skills and qualities. I appreciate the time that we've had to speak with everyone. It's frustrating when you don't get to see your audience and you don't get to listen to the questions and try to respond to them in real time, but I'll make my best effort to look at some of the questions that came through, and then I guess Larry, through you, will try to provide some type of written response to some of them.
That will be great. And Chris, will you put some of your thoughts about the oral panels down in writing?
I thought you'd never ask.
Carl, any closing comments?
Yeah, just a quick one. Let everybody get on the way. But I think the first step, obviously, everybody getting on this call and listening to our input is just seeking out advice. And what Chris said hits home for me. That's completely accurate. That really, if you have a testing vendor or if you're working with a professional in the field, that you should be asking them questions about the process, about all the different things related to this whole realm of the mentoring, the recruiting, all the way up through the hire, because we are exposed to so much out there in the field, and we've worked on a lot of different projects and have a lot of insight into it. And so again, pushing whoever you work with to help you get the answers you need is a very valid thing to do. That will help you to help you grow and understand what the best practices are in the industry and how to accomplish the goals that you're truly looking for. And then the secondary point is that what we're finding in the whole process is that I really think that everyone needs to focus on the gaps throughout. You know, Chris had a nice slide of the progression of how you continually kind of work somebody from mentoring, recruitment, all the way through, and the testing process, and then post mentoring. And again, I see that our process breaks down a lot of times with clients that we have gaps. We spend time recruitment and mentoring people, and then that kind of fizzles out, and we might have a year and a half before we actually implement a test. And those kind of gaps in your process cause major damage to your goals and all the things that you're trying to accomplish. So we've done a lot of great studies of how if you increase your ability to get out there and test and capture data and keep people involved in your system, that you really can increase your diversity through your process and maximize the impact of the process and actually identify higher more qualified people. So again,
Fabulous.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for putting up with us. We're 4 minutes over, so thanks for hanging on. I'm going to turn it back over to Cammie. So on behalf of Fire 2020, thank you for tuning in. And Cammie, take it away.
All right, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us on our webinar today. Our next month's webinar will be about cross-cultural communication, increasing recruitment. A link to register for this webinar will be provided in our evaluation email. For more information, please feel free to email us or give us a call. Notes and a recording of the webinar will be available to the attendees, along with any of the answers that the panelists were able to provide to us. It takes about a week for everything to get reconciled together, and then it'll be emailed directly to everyone. If you are interested in looking into Fire 2020's other services, please feel free to visit our website, fire2020.org. And again, thank you to all the panelists for participating in today's webinar and sharing all of your knowledge.